This is American Republic. In case you forgot what class you were in, this is the first video of the last week of class. Hopefully you've been turning in your week 7 packets, picking up your week 8 packets. You may have noticed from the information on there that I am not assigning any additional homeworks or quizzes on this chapter, even though I could have. There's plenty of things I could have assigned. But the focus is I wanted us to be able to get through the notes and then you to take the chapter test. You will only have to worry about the test. Consider that as your final exam during this last week of school. So for you to take the test, though, we got to finish the notes. So let's get right into it. Remember, we've been talking about the Cold War, this conflict, but not really a conflict, between the U.S. and the USSR. Think of it more as competition between the two world powers. But sometimes competition can get rather heated. Best example of this taking place in the early Cold War era was in Korea. The Korean conflict will take place from 1950 to 1953. First of all, North Korea was communist and South Korea was free. The Soviet Union had seized part of the Korean peninsula during World War II. The Yalta Agreement allowed the Soviets to maintain control of Korea north of the 38th parallel. Again, they promised fair and free elections. Again, they broke that promise and set up their style of government in North Korea. South Korea held elections and established the Republic of Korea with Seoul as its capital. Diplomats held talks, hoping to unify the country, but the talks broke down. And then, as is expected, the North invaded the South, pushing them as far south as the Pusan perimeter. Open your books to page 487. On 487, it shows you a map of the Korean peninsula, and you can see where the Pusan perimeter is located. That's how far south North Korea pushed as of August 1st, 1950. The UN Security Council called an emergency session to deal with the crisis. It demanded North Korea's immediate withdrawal, but North Korean troops were still in South Korea 2 days later. The Security Council suggested that the UN provide military aid to South Korea. The USSR was boycotting the UN at this time, so it passed, and the UN gets involved. UN peacekeeping forces led by the U.S. and General Douglas MacArthur surprised the North Koreans by attacking behind their lines in amphibious landings at Incheon. Again, if you're looking at the map, you can see how with the blue line, seeing how they went by sea, attacked Incheon behind North Korean lines and was able to take them completely by surprise. Because U.S. forces made up 4/5 of the UN troops, Truman was able to select the experienced MacArthur to lead the campaign. North Korean troops, well equipped by the Soviets, had taken most of the peninsula, but when MacArthur attacked near Incheon, within 2 weeks, South Korea had regained all of its lost territory, and UN forces were pushing now into North Korea. In fact, the idea was now, hey, why don't we liberate all of North Korea for democracy? Well, that's an idea. As UN forces reached the Yalu River, which, by the way, is the northern border of Korea with China, which we remember became communist, sent in troops to stop the advance. Chinese forces numbered around 200,000, and they drove the UN troops back to the 38th parallel and into South Korea. So, quick question to ask you. If you were General Douglas MacArthur, what would your response be? Well, Truman wanted to maintain a limited war. Truman's pictured on your left. MacArthur wanted a full-scale war into China. In the end, MacArthur was actually fired for criticizing the president's views. MacArthur said that the Chinese bases and supply lines from China must be bombed with nuclear bombs if necessary. So he wanted a full-scale war, escalating the conflict into China. In making his case, he declared, "There is no substitute for victory." Well, Truman and his advisors thought it more prudent to restore the original boundary with North Korea. He did not want to risk the use of nuclear weapons, nor did he want to risk all-out war with Communist China, or possibly even the Soviet Union. When an angry MacArthur publicly denounced the president's policy of limited war, Truman fired him. In the end, a ceasefire was signed, restoring the 38th parallel as the boundary with a demilitarized zone between the two Koreas. This took place after Eisenhower had become president in 1953. The two Koreas and the DMZ still exist today. What might have happened had MacArthur been allowed to seek a full-scale war with China? Maybe North Korea wouldn't exist. It'd just be a united free Korea. Maybe China would have been liberated from communism. That's the best hope thoughts. Or worse, World War III would have started. Nuclear war would have broken out between the U.S. and the USSR, and the world would have ended as we know it. That's the worst case scenario. Or it could have been somewhere in between. The fact of the matter was, lives were saved by keeping it a limited war. But this conflict in Korea still exists today. Letter F, domestic communism. A new Red Scare swept across the country. When we talk about domestic, we're talking about what's going on inside the U.S. now. As Americans feared that communists were infiltrating the U.S., especially the government. In response, Truman set up a loyalty program to investigate government employees and ensure internal security. The following examples illustrate the very real feeling of Soviet spies in our midst. One individual, a guy by the name of Alger Hiss, he was a State Department official, was accused of being a spy. Whittaker Chambers, a former communist spy himself, testified before Congress that Hiss had passed secret documents to him in the 1930s. Hiss was later convicted of lying under oath, because he had, but not of spying, because the statute of limitations had expired on the accusation of spying. A couple named Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were convicted and executed for giving atomic secrets to the Soviets. These incidents prompted congressional investigations, including those of the House Committee on Un-American Activities. Congress passed the McCarran Internal Security Act, which made it easier for the government to combat spying and required communists and their organizations to register with the Justice Department. Another individual who tried to take advantage of this new Red Scare was a guy by the name of Joseph McCarthy. McCarthy accused the State Department of harboring communists. But after some reckless and false accusations, he was censured. In fact, McCarthy at one point waved a piece of paper in front of Congress, in front of the House, saying, basically that I have a list of all the names of all the communists in the government. Of course, when asked to list some of those names, he balked, showing that he was more talk than action. His opponents coined a new word, McCarthyism, to describe McCarthy's tactics of attacking someone by distorting facts, casting suspicion, and making outright false accusations. Not a single person ended up being charged by McCarthy during this whole Red Scare. Censured means he wasn't kicked out of Congress, but he was basically publicly confronted for his actions, basically told to cut it out publicly, and that kind of ended his political career. We've got a little bit of time, so let's begin into Roman numeral 4. Roman numeral 4, the Eisenhower and Kennedy years. Up till now, we've talked primarily about President Truman. Truman decides not to run again in 1952. He could have, but he chooses not to run, and so we have a door open for another president. In 1952, Republican Dwight D. Eisenhower defeated Democrat Adlai E. Stevenson. Eisenhower's slogan was, "I like Ike," and most Americans agreed. After all, he was a war hero from World War II. He beat Stevenson in the election and then would beat him again in 1956. For the first time in over 20 years, the nation had a Republican president. Let's briefly talk about Eisenhower's domestic agenda. Remember, domestic means what's happening in the U.S. The U.S. and Canada undertook a joint project called the St. Lawrence Seaway to allow ocean-going vessels to sail from the Atlantic to the Great Lakes. The Seaway deepened the St. Lawrence River and built canals and locks where necessary. It also allowed the making of electricity. It helped the economies of both nations. Also during this time, Congress passed the Federal Aid Highway Act, also known as National Interstate and Defense Highway Acts, to construct interstate highways. How many of you used the interstate highway, I-75, recently? Well, guess what? You can thank Dwight D. Eisenhower in his time in office for the creation of the interstate highway system. Before this time, we'd have just had local roads, local highways, state highways, but now the interstate highway system exists to help people and to help the military travel quickly across the U.S. when necessary. Increased vehicle traffic in the U.S. pressed the nation's infrastructure to the limit. To ease the traffic and provide a way to move troops and equipment in case of war, the Highway Act approved construction of 41,000 miles of interstate highways. One more thing we'll mention today. In 1959, Alaska and Hawaii were added as states in 1959. These states are unique because they're not contiguous. That means they're not connected. You think the other 48 states do touch each other. Alaska and Hawaii do not. Also, they are unique because of their populations. About 1/5 of the Alaskan citizens are Indian, and half of Hawaii's citizens are of Asian descent. You might ask, what kind of benefits were there for adding Alaska and Hawaii into the Union? Well, Alaska is next to the Soviets. It would kind of give us a closer view of keeping an eye on the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Also, Hawaii provides better authority in the Pacific. We need to make sure that our fleets can cross the Pacific easily, and having a state right in the middle of it really helps. Do you think the U.S. will ever add another state? And what benefits would that area offer the U.S.? That's a perfectly opinion-type question. Usually the most popular answer, if we were to add another state, would be to add a place like Puerto Rico or Guam as states. Who knows? Maybe, maybe not. Fact of the matter is, though, it hasn't happened for the last 61 years. That's all we're going to cover for today. Hope you all have a good rest of the day. Be good, do good. Bye.